My passion over 30 years of my career has been innovation and technology development. And more recently, I've taken on the editorship of the journal Technology Analysis Strategic Management, which is one of the journals that captures developments in thinking about innovation, and indeed including innovation in ICT. So I would like to encourage some of you to perhaps think about submitting good papers to that journal. That's the advertising over. Yes, I have recently retired from the Open University, where I was Dean of the Business School. And of course, that was itself, as the principal this morning said, the Open University was itself a major innovation, and its particular hook was quality at scale pedagogy. And I want to say a bit more about that later. In the meantime, I would like you to just think and reflect on what you mean, what you understand by innovation on the one hand and disruption on the other hand. And in particular, I must say I like Tim's final slide there. Ask yourself the question, is innovation always completely new? Is innovation purely a technical category? And is disruption a purely technical characteristic? So while you're reflecting on that, let's now turn to asking questions. And can I just check that at the back there you can see that okay? Yeah? Down the pub, if someone asks me, what do you do? I say I study innovation and how ideas become reality. That's really the core. More formally, I guess, innovation would be described as the commercial exploitation of new ideas for practical purposes. So it has to have some intended real impact. So it's not just an idea, it's out there in the world and having impact. And I think that's something that we are very interested in today. Innovation has been a field of serious study for 40 years or so. It's got older roots far beyond that, from Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and famously Joseph Schumpeter. But really it came together as a coherent field of study about 30 years ago, and then was on the margins. Very odd thing to do. On the margins of business studies, economics, and social studies of science and technology. But it's now very much center stage. Governments talk about innovation. Obama had a technology and innovation plan. We have departments of business and innovation and skills in the UK, etc., etc. And because it's become center stage, everyone is piling in. And what's worrying, what's exciting about that is that many more new ideas are now coming in about innovation. But at the same time, some of that past careful work done, the understandings are becoming diluted. And I think that what strikes me is that the use of the term disruption is a good example. It was a term that emerged in 1993, work done at Harvard, and it's somehow gone viral, and now it's used very generally, metaphorically, to cover everything that might be a little bit of a change. Indeed, innovation surely is something that creates a change, and then there's various levels of the extent to which that change might go. So to try and recover, what I'd like to do overall today is to look at what is innovation, to look at some of the key ideas, and then to look at some examples to draw some conclusions that might help to throw light on the notion of disruption in ICT. Now, innovation has got many different aspects. In particular, I think individual characteristics tend to be focused on, not quite exclusively, but disproportionately perhaps. And we're often talking about creativity and problem solving. So we see innovation as being a category of individuals. But as you can see here, there are many other areas that have been subject to systematic analysis and study, right through the organisation, right up to the broad context. And indeed, there's even a British standard as a guide to managing innovation, would you believe? If we look at individuals, risk-taking versus vision is often celebrated. Now, risk-taking has become positive. But in fact, what's interesting here is that innovators are not, strictly speaking, risk-takers. They know that their innovation is going to change the world. And they work persistently until they can make that happen. James Dyson, for instance, comments that he tried out 4,000 prototypes before he got his new vacuum cleaner to work. He was determined to bring that into being. As Schumpeter said, the people who take risks aren't innovators, they're the financial backers. So persistence and failure is something that is certainly at the core of the innovative process for individuals. I quite like the comment here that Edison made that they weren't failures at his 5,000 different prototypes for the electric light bulb. They were just trials. And I'm also reminded of, in a rather different context, Winston Churchill's comment that his career was one of moving from failure to failure, or success was a matter of moving from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm. Very, very true of innovation, and it's something that innovators have to remember. I mentioned the context was important. And again, the systematic understanding and the journal Technology Analysis Strategic Management is showing a wealth of information from around the world, often at the industrial context, industry context, sectors, government policy, etc. level. And that clearly conditions what individuals can achieve. So very briefly, that's what innovation is as a field and as a topic. So what are the key ideas that we might think about in applying to ICT? Well, again, I think there are many of these. I can't possibly deal with them all just now, but the standard model, very simple model, incremental innovation, or the standard view of innovation, usually goes something like this. If the technology is going to behave. And it looks like it's frozen on me. And this model, a linear model is often called, we see it reflected in the standard, mature business organization with separate R&D departments, engineering, marketing, and commercialization. Now, as well as starting with invention, a technology push approach, sometimes fueled by a lone inventor, we can also start at the market end with market pull, where marketing departments will identify a potential new product, and then they will go through the invention development process before going on to diffusion. Now, that model is very effective and works in consumer goods industries, works in whiskey as well. I had the pleasure to do some research in that area. And most modern automobile production, and particularly in pharmaceuticals. And there are limits, of course. It does not work for ICT in general. In ICT, I think we've got something that's far more configurational. And here, I think it's a very important key insight that configurational technology is where you take many different components, many of them technological, but not all necessarily technological, and the innovative element derives not from any particular technology element, but from a way the whole thing works together. And I think the example of the iPhone, people often say, well, what was new about that? All the elements had been there before, but it was the package that was put together that had the disruptive impact. And that, I think, for ICT is a general important insight. And the other element is that it's not simply the technology, but it's the practices around the technology, the social engagement, etc., that also lead to the innovative power. Platform innovation is one that I think is perhaps a new category being explored. Mobile technologies, the mobile phone, the apps world, probably, for my money, the most dramatic change has been with the extension of mobile phones. There are now, I believe, on current trends, in a few years' time, there'll be 2 mobile phones per individual human being on the planet Earth. The impact there, especially in developing countries where mobile phone penetration is far, far in excess of any other computer or laptop penetration, is just very dramatic. I think that it's worth looking at, in more depth, at disruptive innovation, because it's really new wine in old bottles, perhaps. Schumpeter famously identified radical innovation, and that used to be the term that people used. Nowadays, people talk about disruptive innovation. And Schumpeter's famous quote here, that there is a complete change in technology from one regime to another, is very important. And the sense of disruption, I think, is caught up in these perennial gales of creative destruction. And this is 1942, so, what's really new? The disruptive versus sustaining debate was highlighted by Christensen as early as 1993. If you look at technological change in terms of performance and in terms of effort or times, then the different technologies, their development, there'll be some form of discontinuity, and that's an element, I think, of disruption. But what Christensen pointed out is it's not simply the technical side. He pointed out that there's also the reception of the technology that is an intrinsic part of disruption. So it's not simply a disruptive technology. A disruptive innovation is a way that the technology is built into a configuration that engages with social life in quite a different way. And I think we've seen that this morning with the various discussions we've had. It's not the technology, it's the way that culture, it's the way that individual identities are built and influenced by the technology. So his analysis of disruption was that you can characterize different customer groups, demanding, average, and least demanding, by some form of increase in expectation over time. But technologies tend to develop faster, but some technologies, most in fact, tend to stay within the existing expectations of the existing customer base. But some technologies, in fact, start out from quite a different position and bring in new, quite different customers who would never have used the original technology, and eventually they take over and push out the the older technology. So that's a sort of refinement of the radical element that I think is useful. And the key element there is that the real issue is not the technology by itself, but the way that the technology works with the customer base, with the users, with those outside the technology itself. Examples here: flat screens versus television tubes, quite clearly disruptive. There's no real CRT industry left. Christensen's work focused on the way that mainframes were displaced by mini computers and then in turn by personal computers. And I think we are now seeing another phase where laptops are, first of all, displace personal computers, and now tablets are beginning to displace mini computers. And I've asked the question here: is the Open University's approach to education a disruptive element? So all of these different ideas about innovation can help to cast light on how innovation happens and what is meant by disruption. So let me look at some examples now. Again, quite a few examples here. Let me just touch on the newspad, the electronic newspaper. First tablet newspaper in the late 90s. It was about the size of an iPad, except it was 3 times as thick and weighed, I don't know, a couple of kilograms. But one finding from experiments that we found with that was the idea that you'd have a symmetry between the users and the journalists, that in principle, the citizens, the people who read the newspaper, could hold the newspaper up, take a picture, and then you'd got quite a different structure to the way that people interacted. Now, that very much has been realized through the various blogs and through the ability of individuals to use mobile phones to photograph and then to feed back into the news situations. The persona, electronic contraceptive, I don't know if many of you have heard about that. It was an interesting project that I carried out. It's a small thing the size of a glasses case. It uses clever electronics, neural networks, to look at the fertility cycle and driven by information from hormonal testing of urine samples. Now, this was a project that was carried out in participant observation mode by myself with the cooperation of my wife. And as a consequence, I have to report I now have 5 children. What is interesting about this is it's very clever technology, but it ultimately failed. There was a class action because it turned on this fact that it was claimed to be 94% effective. Now, it so happens that's about the same as a condom. But when you turned it around and told people that meant that 6 in 100 women would get pregnant, there was a completely different reaction to it. Now, as a contraceptive device, they were taken to court. You can still buy it. Some people still use it. It received accolades from the Roman Catholic hierarchy, the Jewish religious establishment, and Muslims for different reasons. A very interesting interaction of the technology there. Now, that looks like a failure, but in fact, it's now being marketed as a fertility aid. So the same, now what that shows is that this is a configuration, it's an innovation, but with one set of social expectations. It didn't work, or it does, but it requires a lot of care on the part of the people using it. But with a different set of expectations, it does work. So the overall innovation encompasses those practices and expectations. Let me now look at something that I've spent 8 years working and looking at, the Open University. And the Open University Business School has got something like 43,000 students. It's quite a lot. But we've only got 60 academics. And I was very interested to know how that worked, because we also get very good quality student satisfaction feedback, very good indeed. The OU as a whole was number 1 ahead of Oxford in the last student satisfaction survey, whatever you think about that. I don't think Edinburgh did quite as well. Now, the key there is that the learning experience is team designed. So it's not individuals, it's not lectures, it's a carefully crafted pedagogic interaction with the students. It is designed, goes through beta testing, etc. Very importantly, there are trained tutors, and there may be some in this audience here, who support the students on their learning journey. And that actually is the critical element that supports the quality of the Open University learning engagement, not the materials. Content is now a commodity. If we jump to MOOCs, frankly, that's a commodity that's being offered. The key to successful learning is the quality of the tutor, the learning support. Underneath that, of course, there are very thorough quality assurance systems to monitor that tutors are doing what they're supposed to do, that they give the feedback in time, the feedback's of appropriate quality, and that the students are attending, etc. In the business school, we found another wrinkle, and this is something I'm very proud of my time there, that we identified the fact that because of the nature of distance, we're taking the educational materials, the learning experience, into the workplace. We're able to harness an immediate practice-based learning loop. And that added a very strong element to the learning experience. But that was designed in, increasingly. And yet, overall, my conclusion, and the principal suggested this morning, that Open University is not disruptive. It's strongly sustaining. I often get approached by people who say, I just wanted to, and I know they're going to tell you how the OU changed my life. And typically, they'll have started out at the OU, and then moved on to conventional university, or been at the OU and moved on to conventional university. The Open University has increased access, but it's actually become part of sustaining the system, not really disrupting it, providing an alternative model, but really working with the existing system. Now, the main conclusion, I think, for the topic today is that actually it's the pedagogy that's primary, not the technology. I haven't mentioned the technology so far because it started out correspondence course materials, printed materials. We now use Moodle as a learning platform, but that's beside the point. It's actually the engagement of tutors and the processes that people go through, the pedagogy, not the technology. The technology is important, and it enables you to take the learning into different places. So the business school had 13,000 students in Russia, through a partnership, 8,000 in the Middle East, etc. So it certainly changes the scope and the access, but it doesn't fundamentally change the basic model that OU worked with. Let's just look at MOOCs, because I'm struggling to understand whether they will be different. And for me, the main difference is if you compare the size of correspondence courses in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, were 600, 700,000 students. They're comparable to what MOOCs are picking up, comparable to what the mega universities of the world currently are picking up. The Open University UK is rather small, as the principal was saying this morning. The key element, and if you then look at just iTunes U, I don't know how many of you have downloaded stuff there, but the Open University alone has got more than 40 million downloads on that open educational resource, free. The real key is involvement of prestigious institutions and teachers, and that's perhaps the difference that the MOOCs world is still exploring. I would expect there to be a flip of interest, and then it will even out and people will see, well, it's not that much different from what's happened before. There's the issue of it being free, and therefore what is the business model? Is it freemium? Do you pay for the tutor support? But the big question for me for MOOCs is, where is the pedagogic tutor or learning support? Where is that? Is that going to be an add-on? Because that's what drives the quality in distance education, not the content, to be honest. That is necessary, but it's not the driver. So that's so much for MOOCs. Let me just look at... I've just finished off a ESRC research project with colleagues at the Open University looking at innovation in educational technology, or technology-enhanced learning, as we eventually focused on. And what we again discovered that the pedagogy was at the core. Around that, you had practices of teachers and lecturers. And then around that, if you're looking at any particular technology, the technology had to fit in with the other technologies used. So this laptop here has to be able to plug into the screen there. So there's an ecology of technical bits that have to work together with the practices of the lecturers and the teachers. And within that, you had a multi-stakeholder community, at least 4 communities: the teaching community, the student community, the pedagogic research community, and the technology community. And all of those had slightly different goals, different ideas. And this system tends to, as a whole, remain super stable. It's very difficult to disrupt that. And the point here is that if you are to disrupt that, and in the educational space, which is one of primary interest here today, it's really the pedagogy that is at the core of that, and it's finding a way of looking at how the pedagogy engages with all of these elements, the technology-enhanced learning complex, not simply the technology by itself. So let me wind up now. I've spotted that my time is probably well up, and move to conclusions. Well, first of all, IT innovation is complex and multifaceted. Well, we all knew that, didn't we? But I think the key aspect, the key takeaway is really that the technical doesn't stand by itself. The presentation by Tim just previously, that technology is not disruptive, culture is. I would extend. It's not that the technology is disruptive. The innovation is disruptive because the whole complex of factors is involved and changes. And the difficulty in the educational arena is that that's a hyperstable system because of multiple stakeholders, multiple interests. It makes it difficult to shove the whole thing over. I would have asked a question of Tim O'Shea this morning when he suggested that the squeezed middle might suffer. I beg to differ. I think that the impact of MOOCs and e-learning is that it winds access. So what we're going to have are a few very prestigious institutions who provide excellent materials, excellent learning experiences. But at the same time, the pedagogy, the tutor support is crucial. And in fact, what are universities for? I've got 4 children at who have been through university, and I would say that the learning is actually somewhere 3rd or 4th on the list. They're there for the social networking, for having a growing up experience. Finding a mate is pretty important. Now, those are things that the MOOC world will have to grapple with if it's going to truly disrupt the existing educational provenance. The existing education has got many more elements to it, if you like, the complex associated with education, than simply the technical. The technical maybe can trigger that or not. Let me finally conclude by just some interesting observations here. I was at a talk recently in London where someone claimed that the total data capacity now in existence in the world was sufficient to capture everything that had ever been printed. Now, obviously not everything that's ever been printed has been captured, because I've got a few letters at home that certainly haven't been captured, but in principle, and that is still increasing. The memory is still increasing. So we have an interesting situation of a world where in the future, everything is synchronously available. Maybe the reverse time travel that was mentioned this morning. So our grandchildren, my grandchildren, will know a lot more about me, God forbid, but even look at some YouTubes of me doing embarrassing things, no doubt, than I know about my grandparents. Indeed, I think it's true to say that my grandchildren will know more about my grandparents than I do, because we're now living in a world that is simply quite different. And if we add into that the Internet of Things with ubiquitous tagging, then where are we going to go? One nice example here was Galileo's notebooks. They've been captured for historical research at very high resolution, and so now myriads of scholars can get access to that as if looking under a microscope, so they can look at where he's changed his wording because they can see the way the fibres have been displaced. Now, before, you had to go through it was very restricted because you had to go through a process of wearing gloves, gaining access, etc. What's that going to do to the nature of scholarship? One point that I haven't emphasised but is really bound up in the whole discussion is that the role of users is crucial through this. We're all users. Innovation is no longer the preserve of just the people making the technology. By virtue of the necessary engagement with our practices and by virtue of the affordances of apps, etc., on mobile phones, we are all potentially innovators. So yes, it's an exciting new world, potentially disruptive in the sense of creating radical change, and everybody has a part to play in it. Thank you.